Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. I'm Pinky Webb. Today on the program, after going missing for 10 months, an overseas Filipino worker was found dead in Abu Dhabi. The family appeals to President Rodrigo Duterte to give justice to Mary Anne Daynolo's death. Also, the Supreme Court began its oral arguments into the controversial anti-terrorism law. One of the petitioners, Albay Representative Edcel Lagman, tells us more in the program. Petitioners against the controversial Anti-Terrorism Act make their case before the Supreme Court. The High Tribunal began hearing oral arguments on the most challenged law in recent history as 13 representatives seek to declare the law unconstitutional. Our senior correspondent, Anjo Alimario, has the details.
Petitioners try their best to convince 15 justices to declare the controversial anti-terrorism law unconstitutional. They remind the justices this is not a war between the petitioners and the government, but one colossal battle between the Constitution and an unjust law. Lawyer Shell Jokna says if the anti-terrorism law had existed in 1986, Cardinal Saint's call for people power would easily qualify as inciting to terrorism. He said by exhorting the people to gather at EDSA, Cardinal Saint incited them to engage in acts intended to cause extensive interference with critical infrastructure and to endanger people's lives. Jokno added anyone who tweets for people to attend a peaceful rally could be arrested for engaging in acts intended to endanger a person's life due to the danger of COVID-19. Justice Marvic Leone said he understood the fears of the petitioners because he himself experienced it when he was still a public interest lawyer. As an associate justice, however, Leone said they should be careful not to become a political department. They should not substitute their political wisdom with those who crafted the law. Leone also criticized the lack of an actual, clear case among the petitioners. He says it would be better to question the law at the lower courts where evidence can be received, not in the Supreme Court, which is not a trier of facts. The senior magistrate said the case of two Aitas being charged with terrorism may be an actual case. On the power of the Anti-Terrorism Council to tag terrorists, lawyer Evelyn Ursua says a person could be arrested, detained, prosecuted, and his assets frozen. She points out that these should be considered judicial actions. Justice Rosemary Carandang asked if the provision on delisting is not enough. Ursua answered that the process of delisting is only found in the implementing rules and regulations and the council can simply ignore it. Carandang asked the petitioners what would happen if the entire anti-terrorism law was junked. Lawyer John Mola said the Human Security Act would then be revived and the only thing that would be missing is Section 29, that is detention without judicial warrant of arrest. Speaking of the two Aitas, they went here to the Supreme Court to intervene in the petitions challenging the law. They're accused of killing a soldier in an alleged encounter, but their lawyers deny this, saying the evidence against their clients were just planted. Is this actual case that the petitioners are waiting for? The court decides next week if they will be allowed to join. Anjo Alimario, CNN Philippines.
Let's go straight to the source of the story. We have Albay 1st District Representative Edcel Lagman. Congressman Lagman, welcome to the source. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me again.
First day of the oral arguments yesterday, the petitioners were actually asked, of course, to make their case. First of all, I wanted to find out from you, overall, how do you assess the first day of the oral arguments?
Well, the presenters did very well in trying to convince the Supreme Court to junk the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. And Pinky, the 37 petition challenging the constitutionality of ATA is ripe for adjudication for the following reasons. Number one, facial challenge without waiting for an actual case to happen can be mounted against the ATA for imposing prior restraint on the freedoms of speech, expression, and the press by criminalizing new offenses like threat, proposal, and inciting to terrorism. These new crimes chill the exercise of free speech for fear of arrest, detention, prosecution, and conviction, even if there are vague definitions of terrorism. Hence, instead of freely expressing their freedom of expression or expressing their views and opinions, citizens are coerced or restrained or cowed to silence. Number two, when a statute is challenged because it transgresses the freedom of expression, according to the Supreme Court, in the case of SWS versus Comelec, the presumption of regularity of a statute is reversed. So much so that that statute which is being challenged is presumed to be unconstitutional, and it is the burden of the state or the government to prove otherwise.
Congressman,
Number
let me cut you there, because how you started this interview, it's as if you, to my understanding, Congressman, you're answering a question or a statement made by Associate Justice Marvic Leonen. At some point during that oral argument, Justice Leonen was saying to the effect that wala pa pong actual case dun sa petition. And I think he went as far, but this I'm not very sure if it would have been better to have filed this possibly in a lower court where evidence can actually be submitted. Is that that portion where you were referring to why wait for a case because this is a restraint on freedom of expression?
Yes. Pinky.
Okay.
Because when you make a facial challenge based on the law itself, because the abuse and violation is embedded in the law, not in speculative fears, then there is no need for an actual case to happen. And this has been sustained in a number of cases here and abroad. So much so that we would submit that these petitions are ripe for adjudication.
Okay.
I would cite...
Yes, Congressman.
Pinky.
You would cite?
I would cite in particular Section 29
Opo.
of the A,
Yeah.
which authorizes detention without judicial warrant of arrest.
I think that's where you were focused on, no, Congressman Lagman? I heard you yesterday, and the questions propounded by Associate Justice Carandang. So I want to go back to your part of the argument, which is actually Section 28 of the ATA. You were opposing, of course, this 24-day detention of alleged suspects without a judicial warrant of arrest, noting that even when the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is suspended, a suspect must be brought to court within 3 days. So I want to move forward to that. That's what I heard you say, part of what you said. To this, see, Associate Justice Rosemary Carandang had said, and I quote, "Since terrorism is a new phenomenon, endangering lives and liberties of people and properties as well, cannot Congress legislate longer period of detention more than what is prescribed under Article 125 of the revised Penal Code?" What is your answer to that, Congressman Lagman?
Well, in the first place, the relative novelty of the crime of terrorism compared to the traditional offenses punished under the revised penal code will not make terrorism out of the coverage of the omnibus provision in the Constitution that even during the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, a person cannot be detained for more than 3 days. He should be released or charged in court within that period of time. That would cover all crimes, present and prospective. So terrorism would have to be included in that omnibus
Okay,
coverage.
but when the words new phenomenon is used by Associate Justice Carandang, that almost makes one think, a layman like me, na wala pa ho kasi when the Constitution was being drafted. And I know you went as far as the 1935 Constitution and the 70, the 87. If it's a new phenomenon, my understanding, again, I want to go back to that as a layman, is it was possibly not thought of back then. Hence, Congress needs to legislate a law that would allow a longer period of detention for suspects on terrorism.
Pinky, it is most ironic that in times of emergency, when the writ of habeas corpus is suspended, the time limitation is 3 days for detention.
Okay.
But during ordinary times, under the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, the detention, which is extrajudicial because there is no judicial intervention or oversight, is for a maximum of 24 days. That would violate what has been institutionalized in our Constitution. And moreover, the provisions of Article 125 of the revised Penal Code on the time limitations would be there, because there is need to implement the provision of the Constitution with respect to warrants of arrest being issued only by a judge upon probable cause, and the other rights to the presumption of innocence, for example, the right to bail, the right to speedy disposition of one's case,
Right.
the right to application of habeas corpus, and the right against torture. All of these are being violated by a long or prolonged detention.
Very quickly, though, I also wanted to go to an argument you made, Congressman. You were saying basically that there was grave abuse of discretion when Congress, both houses, passed the ATA.
Yes, definitely, Pinky. And the odious violations of the Constitution authorized by the ATA would be emphatic and manifest evidence of that grave abuse of discretion, which originated in the Senate.
Senator Ping Lacson as author.
And in the House, in particular, there was an expeditious legislation whereby there was no extensive discussion or debate,
Right.
and also curative amendments were not considered and rejected outright in order to foreclose the efficacy of a bicameral conference committee, because the two bills would have no difference at all, because the version of the House was a copycat of the version of the Senate.
All right. Basically, what you're saying, Congressman, is minadali. In Filipino, minadali po ito, hindi po nagkaroon ng sapat na pagkakataon para sa debate at diskusyon at ipinasa na lang po ito. Kaya you're saying that there was grave abuse of discretion when the ATA was passed. But Congressman, we need to take a very short break. We'll be right back. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guest today, Albay 1st District Representative Edcel Lagman. Congressman, let's also talk about what you were saying when you were looking into and focusing on Section 29. You talked about possible torture, I believe. That could happen within this prolonged 24-day detention. Ano po?
Before I answer that, Pinky, let me just go back where we left off.
Okay.
With respect to the abuse of discretion on the part of the Congress, more particularly here, the House of Representatives. This bill was passed by the House in a single session with barely 4 hours of supposed deliberations. In my case, I seasonably reserved my right to interpolate. I was never called to interpolate. And during my explanation of negative vote, I asked the leadership to explain why I was not called to interpolate. They never answered me.
All right, Congressman. So let's go to also what could happen within the 24-day detention of a suspect.
A prolonged detention would be conducive to acts of torture in order to get information or even coerce a confession. That is why long detention without judicial intervention or judicial oversight should be prescribed in order to avoid the incidents of torture.
There is an argument, though, on that once a suspect is detained, the judge must be informed, the nearest judge must be informed that a suspect was detained, and to also inform the judge on the mental and physical condition of the detained suspect. Does that not suffice?
That is not sufficient, Pinky, because there is only a written notice. In fact, the written notice is not even required to be verified or to be under oath. So, presenting officer can just make false statements in that notice, and he is not responsible or accountable. Unlike in the Human Security Act, when there was a requirement that before detention, the suspect should be brought physically before a judge, so that the judge could identify those apprehending officers and the one apprehended to find out why there was an apprehension, and also to determine whether the one apprehended or the suspect has been subjected to torture.
And of course,
this has been implicated in the ATA.
And of course, the definition of terrorism, which all petitioners have described it as broad and vague, that was also taken up yesterday. And there's still a long way to go, Congressman Lagman, because the next oral arguments, I believe, will be next Tuesday. And you have over 10 other associate justices who will be propounding questions and clarifications from the petitioners. So let's leave it at that for now, Congressman Lagman. I'd like to bring in, of course, this the House panel green lights the proposal for economic charter change. Ano po, the resolution seeks to amend yung sinasabi nilang restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution by inserting the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. The committee dropped a provision that will allow foreigners to own land in the country, and a retired Supreme Court Associate Justice says the House and the Senate must vote on the matter separately. So let's talk about that, the manner by which this was passed by the House panel. Congressman Lagman, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the fatal phraseology in that amendment is unless otherwise provided by law. In other words, it is the Congress which is given the authority to fill in the blanks or actually to make the necessary amendments. This cannot be done because under our Constitution, the process of proposing amendments to the Constitution would be by a Constituent Assembly, by a Constitutional Convention, or by People's Initiative. The Constitution cannot be amended by mere legislation.
So that doesn't work. Basically, you're saying the insertion of this unless otherwise provided by law in the supposed economic provisions of the Constitution to ease the restrictive parts.
Yes, Pinky, because if you want to liberalize or alienate the nationalistic provisions in the Constitution, we should be able to provide the parameters, how low should be the equity, if there is any, or should we remove completely the citizenship requirement. This should be the authority vested in the three modes of amending the Constitution, but it should not be delegated to the Congress.
But you may be able to form as a constituent assembly.
Well, that is a requirement.
Yes.
If we have to propose amendment to the Constitution, the House by itself cannot be a constituent assembly, because a constituent assembly is composed by the representatives and the senators, not acting as legislators, but as members of a constituent assembly.
I do remember Associate Justice Ascuna, congressman, that said that if indeed the words otherwise, unless otherwise provided by law, is going to be placed, it should be strategically, I think he used the words strategically placed, or it needs to be put in its right place within the Constitution. All right, so Congressman, go ahead.
Wherever it is placed, the fact is, unless otherwise provided by law, is fatal, because it delegates to the Congress the power to amend the Constitution.
All right. Albay Representative, 1st District Representative Edcel Lagman. Congressman, maraming salamat po sa inyong oras.
Thank you very much, Pinky. I would like to also say that juxtaposed with the Bill of Rights, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 will not stand the test of constitutionality. It hangs by a slender thread which can be shred by the Supreme Court without any difficulty.
Thank you, Congressman Lagman. In other news, an independent daughter and a loving sister. That's how the family describes Mary Anne Daynolo, the Filipino worker found dead in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. The family recalls their last conversation with the OFW in this report by Tristan Odalo.
Hindi ko matanggap na ganun ang anak ko na pinatay na walang kalaban-laban.
Up to the last minute, the mother of Mary Anne Daynolo was hoping that her daughter would be found alive. But after 10 months of frantically searching for her, the family's worst fears were confirmed in January.
Pinatay siya na hindi siya normal na namatay sa sakit o anuman. Yung bang sobra, sagad hanggang buto, abot ng hanggang langit yung sakit na naramdaman ko bilang isang ina na ang ginawa nila sa anak ko.
CNN Philippines obtained an exclusive copy of Mary Anne's last conversations with her younger brother, Cedric.
Frustrated lang talaga siya sa work at parang nahihirapan siya sa pera and parang gusto niya nang umalis sa trabaho para maghanap ng panibagong trabaho.
On March 3, 2020, Mary Anne revealed she's exhausted physically, emotionally, and spiritually from work. Mary Anne told her brother that there were times when she would get sick but would eventually recover from it. Her mother recalled that since she was a kid, Mary Anne kept her problems to herself and solved them on her own.
Hindi yan nagpapabigat sa akin o kahit nung nag-aaral pa siya ng college, kahit napakaliit lang na binibigay ko sa kanya na pangbaon, pero hindi yan nagre-reklamo.
Her chat ended by requesting prayers from her family. A day after that, she went missing. Mary Anne was supposed to go back to the Philippines last July for her first vacation after working in UAE for 2 years. But that didn't happen.
Nakikita ko yung tatlong mga anak ko dito. Hindi sila nag-aaway. Hindi sila, napakasaya nila, puro biruan. Kaya parang naisip ko ngayon na kulang na kami ngayon.
In a tweet, Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Boy Locsin Jr. confirmed that the remains of Mary Anne had been found. The UAE police said a colleague confessed to the crime. The DFA assured no stone will be left unturned in the investigation. The family of Mary Anne Daynolo is now closely working with the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, as they conduct another autopsy on her remains. The family also appeals to President Rodrigo Duterte to make sure that justice will be served. Tristan Odalo, CNN Philippines.
And Labor Secretary Silvestre Bello is supposed to guest on the show to talk about this issue, but he is unavailable at the moment. Thank you for joining us here on The Source. I'm Pinky Webb. You're watching CNN Philippines.